At 11:47 p.m. on March 14, 1982, in a converted garage workshop on the outskirts of Cheltenham, England, Geoffrey Pritchard adjusted the dial on his Yaesu FRG-7 shortwave receiver and heard something that made his hand freeze mid-turn. Through the static and atmospheric interference came not the expected amateur radio chatter or BBC World Service relay, but a sequence of numbers spoken in monotone Russian by what sounded like a woman's voice. 4, 7, 2, 9, 1, 4, 7, 2, 9, 1. The transmission lasted 93 seconds, repeated the sequence twice, then vanished into white noise. Pritchard, a 52-year-old postal worker whose hobby was tracking propagation patterns across the HF spectrum, had stumbled onto what British signals intelligence would later confirm as an active Soviet numbers station. A one-way broadcast system used to communicate with deep-cover intelligence officers operating in Western Europe. What made this intercept extraordinary was not the transmission itself. Numbers stations had been documented since the 1950s, their eerie broadcasts a known but officially unacknowledged feature of Cold War espionage. What mattered was the timing, the frequency, and what Pritchard did next. In an era when the KGB's Directorate S maintained an estimated 200 illegals across NATO countries, and when British counterintelligence was still reeling from revelations about the Cambridge Five, this accidental intercept would trigger a cascade of events that exposed operational security failures on both sides of the Iron Curtain and demonstrated how a civilian with no security clearance could inadvertently compromise a covert communication system that had operated undetected for nearly a decade. To understand how a hobbyist's curiosity became a counterintelligence windfall, you have to understand the architecture of Cold War clandestine communications and the peculiar vulnerability of number stations. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union operated a global network of shortwave transmitters, broadcasting encrypted messages to agents who had no direct contact with handlers, no dead drops to service, and no physical links that could expose them. The system's elegance lay in its asymmetry. A numbers station transmission could be received by anyone with a shortwave radio, but only the intended recipient possessed the one-time pad needed to decrypt the message. The broadcast was simultaneously public and secret, hidden in plain sight among thousands of other shortwave signals. The stations themselves were anonymous. No call signs, no station identification, no acknowledgement of origin. They appeared on specific frequencies at predetermined times, transmitted their coded sequences, and disappeared. Western intelligence agencies monitored them obsessively, cataloging frequencies, transmission schedules, and voice characteristics, but the broadcasts revealed nothing actionable. You could record every number, map every frequency, track every pattern, and still have no idea who was listening or what the messages contained. The system's security depended on two assumptions: that the one-time pads were truly random and never reused, and that the recipient's identity remained unknown. Geoffrey Pritchard's intercept would challenge the second assumption in ways Soviet planners had never anticipated. Pritchard was not a spy hunter. He was a radio enthusiast of the old school, a man who had built his first crystal set at age 14 and spent decades chasing the thrill of distant signals. His workshop was a shrine to analog radio technology. Shelves lined with vacuum tubes, coils of antenna wire, logbooks filled with reception reports in meticulous handwriting. He belonged to the Radio Society of Great Britain, participated in DX contests, and maintained a nightly routine of scanning the shortwave bands between 3 and 30 MHz, logging unusual signals and atmospheric conditions. He knew about numbers stations the way any serious shortwave listener knew about them, as curiosities, anomalies that appeared in the spectrum like ghosts, fascinating but ultimately meaningless without the decryption keys. What distinguished Pritchard was his obsessive record-keeping. He didn't just note that he'd heard a number station. He recorded the exact frequency, the time to the second, the signal strength, the atmospheric conditions, the voice characteristics, and any patterns he could discern. On the night of March 14th, he noted that the transmission on 787 kHz had been unusually strong, that the voice was female with what he identified as a Moscow accent, that the number groups followed a 5-digit format, and that the transmission began precisely at 11:47 p.m. GMT and ended at 11:48:33 p.m. He also noted something else. A brief burst of carrier wave interference at 11:46:58 p.m., 32 seconds before the numbers began, suggesting the transmitter had been activated early or that another signal had briefly overlapped the frequency. He logged the intercept in his notebook and thought nothing more of it until 3 nights later, when he tuned to the same frequency at the same time and heard the same voice transmitting a different sequence of numbers. Same format, same duration, same signal strength. He checked his propagation charts and realized that 7887 kHz was not a frequency typically used for international broadcasting at that hour. The signal was too strong to be a distant amateur operator, too structured to be random interference. He began monitoring the frequency nightly, and over the next 2 weeks, he documented 6 transmissions, all following the same pattern. Female voice, 5-digit groups, 90-second duration, always beginning within 2 minutes of 11:47 p.m. On March 29th, Pritchard did something that would alter the trajectory of the case. He wrote a letter to the BBC World Service, asking if they could identify the station. He included his logs, his frequency measurements, and a tape recording he'd made of the March 26 transmission. The BBC, which maintained close but informal ties with GCHQ, the government communications headquarters located less than 3 miles from Pritchard's home, forwarded the letter to their contacts in signals intelligence. Within 48 hours, a man identifying himself as Mr. Harrington from the Radio Investigation Service called Pritchard and asked if he would be willing to discuss his findings in person. The Radio Investigation Service was a real entity, responsible for investigating interference and unauthorized broadcasts, but Mr. Harrington was not who he claimed to be. His actual name was David Kelso, and he was a senior officer in GCHQ's K Division, which handled Soviet signals intelligence. Kelso had been tracking the 7887 kHz transmissions for 11 months. GCHQ had identified the signal as emanating from a transmitter near Smolensk and had classified it as a probable numbers station serving agents in Western Europe. What they didn't have was precise timing data, voice analysis, or any indication of who might be receiving the broadcasts. Pritchard's meticulous logs provided something GCHQ's automated monitoring systems had missed, evidence of a pattern that suggested the broadcasts were timed to a specific recipient's schedule. Kelso met Pritchard in his workshop on April 2, 1982. He examined the logs, listened to the recordings, and asked detailed questions about Pritchard's equipment and methodology. He did not tell Pritchard that he was looking at evidence of an active Soviet espionage operation. Instead, he thanked him for his civic-mindedness, asked him to continue monitoring the frequency and to report any changes, and requested that he not discuss the matter with anyone, framing it as a routine investigation into unauthorized broadcasting. Pritchard agreed, pleased to be of service, and unaware that his hobby had just intersected with one of the most sensitive areas of British counterintelligence. What Kelso recognized in Pritchard's data was a vulnerability. Number stations were designed to be untraceable, but they operated on fixed schedules. If you knew when a transmission occurred and could correlate it with other intelligence, travel records, surveillance logs, communications intercepts. You might be able to identify the recipient. The 11:47 p.m. timing was significant. It suggested the recipient was in a time zone where late evening reception was practical, likely somewhere in the United Kingdom or Western Europe. The consistency of the schedule suggested the recipient had a routine that allowed for regular monitoring at that hour. And the frequency, 7.87 kHz, was in a range that propagated well across Europe, but poorly to North America, narrowing the geographic target area. GCHQ began a parallel operation. They cross-referenced the transmission dates with known Soviet intelligence activities, looking for patterns. They analyzed travel records of Soviet diplomats and trade officials who had visited the UK in the preceding year. They reviewed surveillance logs from MI5, the security service responsible for counterintelligence on British soil, searching for individuals whose movements or communications might correlate with the broadcast schedule. And they intensified monitoring of the frequency, using direction-finding equipment to confirm the signal's origin and to detect any response transmissions that might indicate two-way communication. The breakthrough came not from signals intelligence, but from a bureaucratic accident. On April 19th, an MI5 officer named Patricia Drummond was reviewing routine surveillance reports on Soviet trade delegation members when she noticed a notation about a second secretary at the Soviet embassy named Yuri Volkov, who had been observed making regular late-evening walks near Regent's Park. The walks occurred on Tuesdays and Fridays, always between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, and always followed the same route. Drummond cross-referenced the dates with GCHQ's transmission log and found a correlation. Every Tuesday and Friday, when Volkov took his walk, a numbers station transmission occurred on 7.87 kHz within 30 minutes of his departure from the embassy. Volkov was not under active investigation. He was a mid-level diplomat with no known intelligence role, and his late evening walks had been noted only because MI5 maintained blanket surveillance on all Soviet embassy personnel as a matter of routine. But the correlation was too precise to be coincidental. Drummond flagged the file and sent it to K Division. Kelso saw it on April 21st and immediately understood the implications. If Volkov was the recipient, the numbers station was communicating with an illegal, a deep cover officer operating under false identity with no official connection to the Soviet state. Volkov's walks were not recreational, they were operational. He was likely serving as a signal to the illegal that a transmission was imminent, or he was using the walk as cover to receive the broadcast on a portable shortwave receiver. The decision was made to place Volkov under intensive surveillance. MI5 deployed a team to monitor his movements, photograph his contacts, and document his routine. GCHQ continued monitoring 7.87 kHz and began analyzing the number sequences for patterns that might reveal the encryption method. And Pritchard, unaware of the machinery he had set in motion, continued his nightly monitoring, dutifully logging each transmission and reporting to Mr. Harrington as instructed. On May 4, 1982, the operation took an unexpected turn. Pritchard called Kelso to report that the 11:47 p.m. transmission had not occurred. He had monitored the frequency from 11:30 p.m. to 12:30 a.m. and heard only static. Kelso checked with GCHQ's monitoring stations and confirmed no transmission. The silence was ominous. Number stations did not miss scheduled broadcasts without reason. Either the operation had been suspended, or the Soviets had detected the surveillance and aborted. MI5's surveillance team reported that Volkov had not taken his usual walk that evening. He had remained in the embassy, and no unusual activity had been observed. The next scheduled transmission was May 7th, a Friday. Kelso ordered round-the-clock monitoring of the frequency and intensified surveillance on Volkov. If the transmission resumed, it would confirm the link. If it didn't, it would suggest the operation had been compromised. On May 7th at 11:47 p.m., the transmission resumed. Same voice, same format, same duration. Volkov took his walk, departing the embassy at 11:35 p.m. and returning at 12:05 a.m. But this time, MI5's surveillance team observed something new. As Volkov walked along the southern edge of Regent's Park, he paused briefly near a bench, appeared to adjust his coat, and then continued walking. The pause lasted less than 10 seconds, but it was enough. A surveillance officer equipped with a directional microphone detected a faint audio signal, a shortwave receiver, barely audible, playing through an earpiece. Volkov was listening to the numbers station. The confirmation was definitive. But the question remained, who was the illegal he was servicing? Numbers stations communicated with agents who had no direct contact with their handlers. Volkov's role was likely limited to signaling that a transmission was scheduled or to serving as a backup communication channel. The actual recipient was someone else, someone living under deep cover, someone who had been in place long enough to establish a credible legend and who was valuable enough to warrant a dedicated broadcast schedule. GCHQ's analysts began working backward. They examined the content of the number sequences, looking for patterns that might reveal the encryption method or provide clues to the recipient's identity. One-time pad encryption was theoretically unbreakable, but operational security failures could create vulnerabilities. If the Soviets had reused pad sequences, or if the messages contained predictable elements, dates, locations, instruction codes, it might be possible to extract information through statistical analysis. The analysis revealed something unexpected. The number sequences transmitted on 7887 kHz showed a recurring structural pattern. Every transmission began with a 5-digit group that varied slightly, from broadcast to broadcast, but always fell within a narrow numerical range. GCHQ's cryptanalysts recognized this as a probable message identifier, a header that told the recipient which one-time pad to use for decryption. The subsequent groups were the encrypted message itself, but the header groups showed a pattern that suggested the pads were being issued in sequential order, a violation of proper one-time pad protocol that created a potential vulnerability. If the pads were sequential, and if GCHQ could obtain a sample of the pad material, they might be able to decrypt past messages and identify the recipient. The problem was that one-time pads were physical objects, usually printed on paper or silk, and were kept by the agent. There was no way to obtain a pad without identifying and apprehending the illegal, which would expose the surveillance operation and allow other Soviet agents to escape. The decision was made to continue monitoring and to wait for the illegal to make a mistake. In espionage, patience is a weapon. The longer an operation runs, the more opportunities arise for human error, for routine to breed complacency, for the small deviations that reveal identity. MI5 expanded its surveillance net, cross-referencing Volkov's known contacts with individuals who fit the profile of a Soviet illegal. Foreign-born residents with plausible but unverifiable backgrounds, professionals with access to sensitive information, individuals whose travel patterns or financial activities suggested hidden income or external direction. On June 12th, the break came from an unexpected source. A clerk at the passport office flagged an application for a routine passport renewal submitted by a man named Thomas Brennan, a freelance translator living in Hampstead. The application itself was unremarkable, but the clerk noticed that Brennan's original passport, issued in 1973, listed a birthplace in Dublin, Ireland, while his supporting documentation included a birth certificate from a registry office that had been destroyed in a fire in 1974. The discrepancy was minor, the sort of administrative inconsistency that occurred frequently in an era of paper records. But the clerk followed protocol and referred the application to the Passport Office's Fraud Investigation Unit. The fraud unit passed the file to MI5 as a matter of routine. An officer named Colin Marsh reviewed it and noticed something that made him pause. Brennan's address in Hampstead was less than 2 miles from Regent's Park, within easy walking distance of Volkov's route. Marsh pulled Brennan's file and found a thin but suggestive dossier. Brennan had entered the UK in 1972 on an Irish passport, had established himself as a translator specializing in Russian and Eastern European languages, and had maintained a low profile for a decade. He had no criminal record, no known political affiliations, and no obvious connections to the Soviet Union. But his background was just plausible enough to be suspicious. Ireland's chaotic record-keeping in the early 1970s, combined with the destruction of registry records, made it difficult to verify his identity conclusively. Marsh sent the file to Kelso with a note: possible illegal. Proximity to Volkov's route. Background unverifiable. Recommend surveillance. Kelso agreed. On June 15th, MI5 placed Brennan under discreet observation. The surveillance team documented his routine. He worked from home, translated documents for academic publishers and legal firms, took daily walks in Hampstead Heath, and lived alone in a modest flat. He had no regular visitors, no apparent social life, and no observable contact with Volkov or any other Soviet officials. But on June 18th, a Friday, the surveillance team observed something that confirmed their suspicions. At 11:35 p.m., Brennan left his flat carrying a small leather satchel and walked to Hampstead Heath. He sat on a bench overlooking the ponds, opened the satchel, and removed what appeared to be a portable shortwave radio. He placed an earpiece in his ear, adjusted the radio's dial, and sat motionless for approximately 2 minutes. At 11:47 p.m., the number's station transmission began. Brennan listened, made no notes, and showed no visible reaction. At 11:48:33 p.m., when the transmission ended, he returned the radio to the satchel, stood, and walked back to his flat. The surveillance team photographed the entire sequence. Kelso reviewed the images and authorized a more aggressive approach. MI5 requested a warrant to search Brennan's flat, and on June 22nd, while Brennan was out, a team entered the premises and conducted a covert search. They found the shortwave radio, a collection of books in Russian, and a small metal box hidden beneath a floorboard in the bedroom. Inside the box were 3 items: a one-time pad printed on silk, a microdot reader, and a set of instructions in Russian detailing communication protocols and emergency procedures. The one-time pad was the breakthrough GCHQ needed. The pad contained 50 pages of random 5-digit number groups, each page corresponding to a single message. GCHQ's analysts compared the pad to the recorded transmissions and confirmed a match. They were able to decrypt the messages Brennan had received over the preceding 3 months. The decrypted content was mundane: instructions to maintain cover, requests for translations of specific technical documents, updates on contact, protocols, but it confirmed that Brennan was an active Soviet illegal and that the 78.87 kHz number station was his primary communication channel. The question now was what to do with the intelligence. Arresting Brennan would expose the surveillance operation and alert the Soviets that their communication system had been compromised. Allowing him to continue operating risked whatever intelligence he was collecting. The decision was made at the highest levels of British intelligence and involved consultation with the CIA, which had a vested interest in understanding Soviet illegal networks in Western Europe. The strategy chosen was a controlled exposure. MI5 would continue monitoring Brennan, using the decrypted messages to understand his tasking and to identify any additional contacts or dead drops. GCHQ would continue monitoring 787 kHz and other suspected number stations, using the insights gained from Brennan's one-time pad to refine their understanding of Soviet encryption practices. And when the time was right, Brennan would be arrested in a manner that suggested his exposure had resulted from routine passport fraud investigation, not from signals intelligence or surveillance, thereby protecting the sources and methods that had led to his identification. That time came on September 3, 1982, when Brennan was arrested by special branch officers at his flat on suspicion of passport fraud and immigration violations. The arrest was public, covered by local newspapers as a routine enforcement action. Brennan was interrogated, declined to cooperate, and was eventually charged under the Official Secrets Act after MI5 presented evidence of his espionage activities. He was tried in a closed session at the Old Bailey, convicted, and sentenced to 18 years in prison. The trial revealed nothing about the numbers station intercept or the role of Jeffrey Pritchard. Volkov, whose diplomatic immunity protected him from arrest, was declared persona non grata and expelled from the United Kingdom in October 1982. The Soviet embassy issued a pro forma protest, and Volkov returned to Moscow, where his subsequent career remains unknown. The 7887 kHz number station ceased transmissions on September 4th, the day after Brennan's arrest, and never resumed. GCHQ continued monitoring the frequency for 2 years, but detected no further activity. Pritchard learned of Brennan's arrest from a brief mention in the Times and had no idea of the connection to his intercept until 1997, when declassified MI5 files revealed the role his logs had played in the investigation. By then, Pritchard was 77 years old and still monitoring shortwave frequencies from his workshop in Cheltenham. In an interview with a BBC documentary team, he expressed mild surprise that his hobby had contributed to a counterintelligence operation, but noted that he had simply been doing what any responsible radio enthusiast would do, keeping accurate records and reporting anomalies to the appropriate authorities. The Brennan case revealed several operational vulnerabilities in Soviet illegal networks. First, the use of fixed schedule numbers stations created a pattern that could be correlated with other intelligence, allowing counterintelligence agencies to identify recipients through timing analysis. Second, the reliance on intermediaries like Volkov introduced a human element that could be observed and exploited. Third, the sequential issuance of one-time pads, while operationally convenient, created a structural weakness that reduced the theoretical security of the encryption system. But the case also demonstrated the limitations of signals intelligence. Without Pritchard's accidental intercept and meticulous logging, GCHQ might never have focused on 787 kHz with sufficient intensity to detect the pattern. Without the passport fraud referral, Brennan might have remained undetected for years. The convergence of amateur radio monitoring, bureaucratic routine, and targeted surveillance was not the result of a master plan, but of contingency and luck, the same factors that shaped so many Cold War intelligence successes and failures. What remains unknown is the full extent of Brennan's activities. The decrypted messages revealed only routine tasking, but MI5's post-arrest investigation suggested he had been in place since at least 1972, a decade before his exposure. What intelligence he collected during that period, what documents he translated and forwarded to Moscow, and whether he had contact with other illegals operating in the UK, are questions that remain unanswered. Soviet records from the era remain classified, and Brennan himself, who was released in a spy exchange in 1989 and returned to the Soviet Union, has never spoken publicly about his case. The numbers stations themselves continue to operate, though their use has declined with the advent of digital encryption and satellite communications. As of the early 2000s, monitoring groups documented dozens of active stations broadcasting in Russian, Spanish, and other languages, their purpose officially unacknowledged by any government. The stations remain a Cold War relic that persists into the present, a reminder that some methods of covert communication, however archaic, retain operational value precisely because they are simple, untraceable, and require no infrastructure beyond a transmitter and a receiver. For Jeffrey Pritchard, the case was a brief intersection between his private passion and the hidden machinery of state power. He continued monitoring shortwave frequencies until his death in 2004, logging signals, chasing distant stations, and maintaining the meticulous records that had made him useful to an intelligence apparatus he never fully understood. His workshop, donated to the Radio Society of Great Britain, remains a small museum of analog radio technology, a testament to the era when the electromagnetic spectrum was a frontier explored by amateurs and spies alike, and when a hobbyist with a receiver and a notebook could stumble onto secrets that governments spent billions to protect. In the end, the Brennan case illustrates a paradox at the heart of Cold War espionage. The most sophisticated systems, encrypted communications, deep cover identities, compartmented operations, were vulnerable to the most mundane failures. A passport clerk's diligence, a diplomat's predictable routine, a radio enthusiast's curiosity. The machinery of intelligence, for all its complexity, operated in a world of human behavior, bureaucratic process, and random chance. And sometimes, the difference between security and exposure was not tradecraft or technology, but whether someone was paying attention at 11:47 p.m. on a Friday night in March, turning a dial through the static, and deciding that what they heard was worth writing down.